My name is Yasmin Torres, and I was standing in the parking lot of Desert Ridge Medical Center in Phoenix, holding a cardboard box of 6 years of my belongings, watching my former boss wave at me through his office window like he'd just won something, when I made a promise to myself that I intended to keep no matter how long it took. 2 hours earlier, I had been called into a termination meeting and told, in careful human resources language, that my employment was being ended for insubordination and failure to follow discharge protocol. 2 days earlier, I had refused a direct order to discharge a homeless veteran named Walter Doyle from the hospital while he was still septic, still on 4 antibiotics, and still, by any honest clinical standard, not remotely stable enough to be sent back to a shelter with no follow-up care. And 2 weeks earlier, though I didn't know it yet, that single refusal had already set off a chain of events that would end, less than a month later, with the man who fired me losing control of the entire hospital he thought he owned. I hadn't set out to become anyone's whistleblower. I had spent 6 years as a case manager at Desert Ridge, quietly doing the unglamorous work of making sure discharged patients had somewhere safe to land, and I genuinely believed, right up until the morning I stood in my supervisor's office refusing to sign a discharge order, that I was simply doing my job the way I'd always done it. What I didn't know that morning, what my boss, Grant Pemberton, certainly didn't know when he smiled at me through that window like he'd solved a problem instead of created one, was that I had already started keeping careful records of exactly how many patients like Walter Doyle had been discharged early over the previous year, and exactly which ones had one thing in common that had nothing to do with their medical condition and everything to do with what kind of insurance or lack of it they carried. Grant thought firing me would make the problem disappear. He had no idea he'd just handed the problem a reason to stop staying quiet. 9 years before that termination meeting, I had taken a job as a hospital case manager at Desert Ridge Medical Center, a mid-sized facility on the edge of Phoenix that served a patient population heavier on Medicaid and uninsured walk-ins than most of the newer hospitals across town. I liked the work precisely because it mattered in a very unglamorous way, making sure a discharged diabetic patient actually had a working refrigerator for their insulin, making sure an elderly widow leaving after a hip fracture had a home health referral instead of just a pamphlet, making sure people didn't fall through the enormous cracks that exist between medically stable enough to leave and actually safe once they're gone. Desert Ridge had been privately owned for most of my time there by a regional healthcare investment group, and about 18 months before my termination, ownership consolidated fully under a single majority stakeholder, a businessman named Marcus Holloway, who ran the hospital less like a place people went to get well, and more like an asset he was actively preparing to sell. I didn't understand the financial architecture of the place at first. I understood, slowly, secondhand, through conversations overheard in hallways and comments dropped by administrators who assumed a case manager wasn't paying attention to spreadsheets, that Holloway had taken on significant debt to acquire full ownership, that the debt came with covenants tied to the hospital's operating margins and its uncompensated care ratio, and that a larger regional health system had made a substantial acquisition offer contingent on Desert Ridge's financials looking clean enough to survive due diligence. My direct supervisor, a hospital administrator named Grant Pemberton, had been hired 8 months before my termination specifically, I would later understand, to help tighten those numbers. Grant wasn't a cruel man in any way that was obvious on the surface. He spoke about operational efficiency and length of stay optimization with the genuine enthusiasm of someone who believed he was solving real problems, and in the abstract, some of what he pushed for wasn't unreasonable. Hospitals really do lose money on unnecessarily long stays. Discharge delays really can create bottlenecks that hurt other patients waiting for beds. What I slowly started to notice, over the months that followed, was a pattern that had nothing to do with genuine efficiency and everything to do with which patients got pushed out the door early. The first case that truly troubled me came in January, 10 months before my termination, involving an uninsured construction worker recovering from a workplace injury who Grant personally instructed me to discharge 2 days ahead of his physician's recommended timeline to a home health situation I knew, from my own intake notes, didn't actually exist. When I raised the discrepancy, Grant told me, not unkindly, that the clinical team can always readmit if something changes, a phrase I would come to hear so often over the following months that it started to feel less like medical judgment and more like a script. I began, almost without deciding to, keeping my own private log of similar cases. Patients discharged earlier than their attending physicians initially recommended, cross-referenced against their insurance status. I told myself, at first, that I was probably imagining a pattern where none existed, the way people sometimes see conspiracies in ordinary administrative friction. By August, I had 31 cases logged. Of those, 26 involved patients who were uninsured or covered by Medicaid. The other 5, needing similarly early discharges for unrelated reasons, were commercially insured, and in every one of those 5 cases, notably, the discharge had been delayed rather than rushed. Pending additional testing, the hospital would be reimbursed for at a far higher rate. I brought my log to Grant in September, not as an accusation, but the way I brought him everything, as a case manager flagging a pattern worth reviewing. His expression, when he looked through it, wasn't defensive. It was almost admiring, in a way that unsettled me more than anger would have. "You're very thorough," he said. "I'd be careful who you show this to. It's easy to misread aggregate data without the full clinical context behind each individual case." I didn't misread it. I understood, watching him fold my log closed without addressing a single case inside it, that he already knew exactly what it showed. Walter Doyle was admitted to Desert Ridge on a Thursday night in early October, brought in by paramedics after being found unresponsive outside a downtown Phoenix shelter, in septic shock from an untreated pneumonia that had progressed dangerously over several days. He was 63, a Vietnam-era veteran who had been unhoused, on and off, for nearly a decade, with no listed emergency contact and a chart thin enough that it was clear he hadn't had consistent access to healthcare in years. I was assigned his case on his second hospital day, once his condition had stabilized enough for a case manager consult, and I liked him almost immediately, the way I often liked patients who'd learned, out of necessity, to be careful and observant about everyone around them. He was sharp, dryly funny despite everything, and deeply embarrassed by how much help he needed, which is its own particular kind of dignity worth protecting. On his 4th hospital day, still requiring 4 antibiotics for the sepsis and showing labs that hadn't yet normalized, I received a message from Grant instructing me to finalize his discharge to a shelter intake for the following morning. I told Grant, as respectfully as I knew how, that Walter's attending physician had documented a recommendation for at least 3 more days of 4 antibiotic therapy, and that discharging him to a shelter without a reliable way to complete that treatment risked exactly the kind of relapse that had brought him in critically ill in the first place. "The bed's needed," Grant said. "And frankly, Yasmin, a shelter with a nursing station can manage oral antibiotics just fine once we transition him." The problem, which I explained as clearly as I could, was that no shelter in the city had a nursing station capable of managing IV therapy, and that Walter's physician had been explicit that oral antibiotics weren't yet a safe substitute, given the severity of his infection. Grant's response was polite, firm, and unmistakably final. The discharge order would be entered that afternoon regardless of my recommendation. I refused to sign off on the case management portion of the discharge, documenting my clinical objection in writing, cited directly to the attending physician's own notes. 2 days later, I was called into a termination meeting and told my refusal constituted insubordination and a failure to follow hospital discharge protocol. I didn't know, walking out to that parking lot with a cardboard box, that Walter Doyle's case and my written objection to it had already been forwarded, without my knowledge, by a sympathetic nurse on the floor to someone entirely outside the hospital's chain of command. The nurse's name was Priya Anand, someone I'd worked alongside for years without ever fully realizing how closely she'd been watching the same patterns I had. Priya was active in the Regional Nurses Union, and 2 days after my termination, without telling me first, she filed a formal grievance on Walter Doyle's behalf through the union's patient advocacy channel, attaching my written clinical objection, and a copy of the discharge order Grant had entered over it. I found out about the grievance the same way I found out about most things that week, through a phone call I almost didn't answer from a number I didn't recognize. "My name is Colleen Doyle," the voice said, careful and a little unsteady. "I think you took care of my father, Walter Doyle." I hadn't known Walter, had any living family. He'd told me, gently but firmly, during our first conversation, that he didn't have anyone to list as a contact, and I'd respected that the way I respected every patient's right to define their own history. What I learned from Colleen, over a conversation that left both of us in tears by the end, was that she and her father had been estranged for over a decade, since before his homelessness began, and that she had only found out he was hospitalized because a hospital social worker's discharge planning notation, my own documentation, forwarded through channels I hadn't anticipated, had eventually reached a state ombudsman's office handling an unrelated complaint about the same shelter Walter had been slated for discharge to. Colleen, it turned out, worked as a compliance investigator for the Regional Office of the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, the federal agency responsible for enforcing hospital compliance with patient care and billing regulations. She hadn't gone looking for a case involving her own father. The case had found her through the same bureaucratic paper trail I'd unknowingly helped create, and once she realized whose name was on the chart, she couldn't simply recuse herself and look away. "I need to be careful about how I'm involved, given the personal connection," she told me. "But I can tell you that what you documented isn't a small thing. If the pattern you logged holds up under review, this isn't just about my father. This is a hospital potentially violating federal patient dumping regulations on a scale that could jeopardize its entire Medicare certification." I asked her what that meant practically. She was quiet for a moment before answering. "It means," she said, "that a hospital this size cannot survive without Medicare and Medicaid reimbursement. And it means that any pending sale or refinancing deal almost certainly has a clause requiring the hospital to maintain full regulatory compliance to close. If this is what it looks like, you may have just made that deal very difficult to finish." I didn't fully understand, in that moment, how directly my termination and my discharge log were about to intersect with a financial structure I'd only half understood from hallway gossip. What I learned over the following 2 weeks, largely from Priya, who had far better hospital politics instincts than I did, filled in the rest. Marcus Holloway's acquisition of full ownership 18 months earlier had been financed through a substantial loan from a healthcare-focused private lender, secured against the hospital's assets and revenue, with covenants requiring Desert Ridge to maintain, among other things, full Medicare compliance certification and a debt service coverage ratio that depended heavily on the hospital's operating margins staying above a specific threshold. The pending acquisition by the larger regional health system Holloway had been courting for months included a due diligence period explicitly designed to catch exactly the kind of regulatory exposure my discharge log now represented. Colleen's office formally opened a compliance review into Desert Ridge's discharge practices 11 days after my termination, using Priya's union grievance and my documented clinical objections as a starting basis, expanded quickly once federal investigators requested, and received a full year of discharge records matching the pattern I'd logged independently, entirely without state or federal help, purely by paying attention. Grant Pemberton, I later learned, was informed of the investigation the same week the acquiring health systems due diligence team requested an unusually detailed review of discharge documentation as a condition of moving forward, a request that was, coincidentally or not, prompted by a separate but related tip the acquiring company's compliance office had received from an anonymous source inside Desert Ridge, someone I never identified and never asked Priya to identify either, because by then, it had become clear that I hadn't been the only person quietly keeping their own records. The acquisition collapsed 19 days after my termination, when the acquiring health system's legal team formally withdrew its offer, citing unresolved regulatory compliance concerns that made closing the deal within the agreed timeline impossible. I learned about the collapse the same way most of Phoenix did, through a brief item in the local business press, 3 sentences long, mentioning only that the sale of Desert Ridge Medical Center to a larger regional system had fallen through a mid- and ongoing federal compliance review. What that brief item didn't capture, because it hadn't become public yet, was what happened to Marcus Holloway once the deal died. Without the acquisition to refinance and pay down his acquisition debt, Holloway found himself unable to meet the loan covenants tied to the hospital's now declining operating margins made worse, not better, by the compliance review's mandated changes to discharge practices. His lender, facing a borrower now in technical default, exercised its rights under the loan agreement within 6 weeks, moving to take control of the hospital's governing board and initiate a forced sale process to recover its investment. Marcus Holloway, who had spent 18 months treating Desert Ridge Medical Center as a personal asset to be optimized and flipped, lost effective control of the hospital entirely, replaced by a court-appointed receiver overseeing an eventual sale to a nonprofit regional health system with an explicit mission focus on serving uninsured and underinsured patients, the opposite, in nearly every practical sense, of the deal Holloway had originally been chasing. Grant Pemberton was terminated during the transition 3 months after he'd fired me, in what the new receivership diplomatically described as a leadership restructuring. I felt, when Priya called to tell me, less satisfaction than I expected. Mostly, I felt tired and a little sad that it had taken a near-fatal case of sepsis, a federal investigation, and the collapse of a multi-million-dollar acquisition to force a hospital to simply treat its poorest patients with the same clinical standard it had always given everyone else. Walter Doyle survived his infection, discharged eventually to a stable transitional housing placement with proper follow-up care that I helped arrange myself, informally, in the weeks after my termination, before Desert Ridge's new receivership formally reinstated me with back pay and a written apology I hadn't expected and didn't particularly need by that point. He and Colleen have been slowly rebuilding their relationship since, something neither of us discusses much, because it belongs to them, not to the story of how I lost and then got back a job I'd once loved without reservation. I went back to Desert Ridge eventually, though the hospital I returned to under new nonprofit ownership looked different in ways that mattered. The discharge review policy I'd once been fired for questioning became, under the new administration, a formal, mandatory second review for any early discharge involving an uninsured or Medicaid patient, a policy the hospital now cites, a little ironically, as a model other facilities in the region have started adopting. I still keep a log out of habit more than necessity now, though these days it mostly stays empty, which is exactly the outcome I'd been hoping for all along. Colleen and I still talk occasionally, mostly about her father's slow, steady progress, sometimes about the strange, improbable path that connected a case manager's stubborn documentation habit to a federal compliance office, to a hospital acquisition falling apart in a matter of weeks. She told me once, near the end of the investigation, that most patient-dumping cases her office reviewed never went anywhere, buried under exactly the kind of clinical context excuses Grant had used on me, because most case managers, understandably, couldn't afford to risk their jobs over a hunch. "You didn't have proof when you started keeping that log," she said. "You just had a feeling something was wrong, and you decided the feeling was worth documenting anyway. That's rarer than people think." The last entry in the notebook I started that October isn't a case number or a discharge date. It's something I wrote the night I got the call that the acquisition had collapsed, and I've never crossed it out. They thought firing the person keeping records would make the pattern disappear along with her. They forgot that some habits don't end when the job does, and some records are worth more the moment someone tries to make them go away.